So I'm going to welcome Sarah. Sarah Gold is an expert in data management and privacy. She sits on the board of Tech for Good, and she's going to talk to us about trust and digital rights in learning systems.
Thank you. Hold this up. At IF, we believe that services should respect our rights. So we work with the organisations shaping our digital world to show how they can be trusted with data. Over the last couple of years, we've worked with a whole range of different organisations, and our work is increasingly taking us to quite a specific part of machine intelligence, looking specifically at how people can trust services that are powered by machine intelligence technologies, but also how machine intelligence technologies can be trustworthy in the first place. This is a really important area of work because services are increasingly being powered by machine intelligence technologies, and those services are beginning to creep into really important areas of our life, whether that be helping you to find a job or to manage your finances, or, as we found out last week, deciding on who to vote for. At this point, I want to reframe what I mean by machine intelligence technologies. Matt Jones uses the phrase learned systems, and I think it's really effective because I think it helps us to refocus the issue on people and society, which are the most important things, really. It also reminds us that we actively teach these systems and they operate in a real world context that we must never forget about. So I'm going to talk to you about two things, trust and rights in learned systems. To start, I'm going to talk about trust, and I'm going to give you an overview of 6 insights that we have found from our work at IF, working directly on these issues. And whilst I can't show you exact examples, because I'd be in breach of confidentiality agreements, I have found examples to illustrate these points from the public domain or illustrations from IF's blog to show you. So to start off, design for non-determinism. As designers, we are used to designing for fixed circumstances. It's kind of like if this, then that. With learned systems, that completely changes. As designers, we don't necessarily know what a user will see once the system is showing them a service, because there's an infinite number of possible interfaces that a user might be shown. As a user, that creates a real challenge for trust, because how can you start to have conversations with one another to check, is my thing working right? Does this look good to you? Is this what it should be showing me? If everyone's service is showing them something different, that's a real challenge. At IF, we think that designers should start thinking about designing for frameworks for learned systems to express a range of opportunities within. That's why, as of today, we've launched a project with Alison Powell from the London School of Economics, looking at just that. What do these frameworks look like, and how do you design transparency into the frameworks so that users are able to understand and challenge what a learned system presents them with? If you'd like to follow that project, please do take a photograph of that blog post link there. We'll be working on it over the next few months. Design for legibility and understanding is another principle. Just like handwriting, if someone's handwriting is really messy, it's really difficult for you to read what they've written. In the same way, I think that services are really hard for users to read. And not only that, they're super difficult to understand, even if you can read them. I'd like to ask the audience, how many of you use Spotify or iTunes or Google Play? Hands up. And keep your hands up if you've read the Terms of Service update recently. No one kept their hand up. That's right. We know that terms of service or terms and conditions are not good enough for the digital services that we use today, let alone learned systems. At IF, we think it's possible to begin designing terms of service out by putting the information about when services are learning, what data is being used, and what powers a user has to change that, all at the point of use. You can see on the example to the left, this is an example of a fictional benefits service that we prototyped at IF. And you can see that this individual has received a sanction on their benefit. What we were interested in doing here is showing why the individual received that sanction, to give them that information at the point of use and give them an option to appeal that decision if they think that something's not quite right. This is all about the service explaining itself as it's being used. And we think this is something that will be really important as we see more and more services that are powered by learned systems. In the meantime, before we ditch the terms of service, we think it's possible to make terms of service more legible and easier to understand. We've blogged about some of our thinking on that at Understanding Terms and Conditions, and I'd encourage you to look there at some of the techniques that we think are important to make terms of service more machine readable and more understandable to you and I. Design for override is another interesting area. This is because trust is a two-way relationship. So it really wouldn't be any good if a learned system simply presented a user with decisions that it had made without the user being able to give feedback or to take over. I think it's really important that users are given the ability to take over critical automated processes. And that means that the user has to know they can take over and understand how. This is important for a host of reasons. One of them is skills fade. There's a really nice parallel in the Transport for London. Every Sunday, the London Underground turn off automatic braking to make sure that drivers of tubes don't lose their skills from the automated safety system. I think that's a really nice parallel, and I think there are things we should draw from that in our work on services. Design for recovery is another. So systems are going to go wrong. That will happen. And it's really important for the user to be able to remove any autonomy that the system has, or to revert back to a previous system that didn't fail. And that should be possible without having systemic failure. This is a bit like cruise control in a car. You can have cruise control on for a long time and enjoy the car kind of driving you somewhere. But as soon as you see something quite unusual up ahead or a difficult junction, you should be able to take over. That's really important because there are some actions that you'll be able to navigate better than any system. Design for respectability. This is all about making sure that a user can see what a learned system is doing and why. It's a bit like view source on the web that we have now, or apologies for another car analogy, but if you've ever checked the oil in your engine, it's like that. You should have the ability to check what's happening. And then there's design for collective action. So whilst more technology and more design is needed in this area, they're not the only answers. And in fact, the answer isn't just about more design, more technology, because we have to think about the wider system. And it's really important that we think about the needs of different levels of society. We really can't fall into the trap of this Californian ideology that to understand a learned system or to trust it will be purely an individualistic action. I think it's really important to think about collective action, by which I mean things we can only do together or with the help of organisations that can represent us. At IF, we've been looking at how consumer groups, unions or medical charities can help people they represent understand if a learned system can be trusted, but also those organisations can help society as a whole course correct. You can see the example on the left, going back to that fictional benefits service I showed earlier, that the individual that received that sanction was quite concerned that that sanction was wrong. So they went to an organisation called Citizens Advice. Citizens Advice is an organisation in the UK that helps citizens navigate complexity and hard situations in government services. So this individual who's received the sanction goes to Citizens Advice, and the advisor at Citizens Advice is able to see why that sanction was given and if anyone else in that area was given a similar sanction for the same reason. What's important here is you can see the kind of highlighted decision at the top, this question, which is that 153 other people in the Salford area have missed appointments in April. Would you like to include Mary's case? Because maybe it's that the bus timetable has changed in Salford, so no one in that area can make the right appointment time. So letting organisations help us means we can also have collective action, so we can course correct, so we can see as a society where these systems might go wrong, and hopefully early enough before they cause huge problems. Of course, that means that if you're designing a learned system, you really need to think about where your learned system fits in society and with civic institutions. If you'd like to look at more about what we've been thinking about at IF on that, we wrote a blog post last year on making it clear how machines make decisions. This leads on to the next part of my talk, which is all about rights. So I think that these are three areas that I would argue urgently need addressing by us. The first is GDPR for learned systems. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It comes into force in May this year. It affects every company that holds any information about any EU citizen. Essentially, for us as individuals, it gives us a whole suite of digital rights. Some of them are really interesting, and if you'd like to see what those rights could mean for services that you might use every day, we did some sketching a couple of years ago, and you can find those under newdigitalrights.projectsbyif.com. GDPR's rights are often directly challenge some of the ways that learned systems are built. And that's where these challenges and the questions I have for you come in. So what is an individual's right to deletion in a federated learning model? Because people are complex, data that they give a service could be wrong, or the data they give a service could be right at one moment in time and wrong now. For instance, if someone has a divorce, that will have an impact on maybe how they use their bank account, perhaps the kind of invitations they make in their calendar, or simply what images it would not be okay to show them in their social media feed. These are the kind of everyday problems that everyone has, and these systems need to be able to respond to. So it needs to be possible for this kind of ephemeral design to work, where a system can explain the learning it's got to a user, and the user can choose to keep it or throw it away. So my question is, how can we make ephemeral learning possible in a privacy-preserving way? And how can we make ephemeral design work? Another one is, how can you give a user the right to understand in this world that's non-deterministic that I explained earlier? I think this is a really tricky question, and I think we have to think about the way we deal with data permissions and collective action to answer some of this. Because I think data privacy is just far too complex a thing to be regulated by individuals who are really busy doing important things like making their money stretch or finding food at a food bank. They don't have time to tweak data permissions, or let alone the skills to check that their choices are in fact being respected. And this is where I think we have to think about groups that can represent many of us to help us understand whether certain data should be given to a service and if that service is respecting the choices that we made. Testing in learned systems is the second area. So any system of any complexity in society has required testing. If we take an example of like a fridge in your home will have been tested by consumer rights organisations to make sure that that fridge doesn't set a light in your home. The manufacturer will have also tested that fridge to make sure that it keeps your food at a temperature that's safe to eat at. The manufacturer also will have designed it to standards that have been iterated and decided that this is how we build a fridge. Now, if you take that testing ecosystem question, that will be necessary in learned systems. But how can you create a testing ecosystem that doesn't just test a kind of inanimate object like a fridge that's performance only changes with age, but a learned system that can change in minutes? So how can we create a testing ecosystem that keeps pace with the changes of software? Within this as well, we'll have different people running different models on devices. So how do we verify the authenticity of different versions of models so that people can make sure that the model they're using is trusted? DeepMind are developing verifiable data audit, which is a technology that essentially logs all the different kinds of health information that DeepMind use to provide their services that are used by clinicians to make better decisions about people's care or treatment. Verifiable data audit is essentially a log of lots of information you'd need to look back at to understand how did the clinician make the decision at the time, what information was available to them to make that decision. Verifiable data audit is just one kind of technology that could help us verify complex learning systems. But I think there will be other things we need too, like, for instance, open registries, perhaps, of verified models. Or maybe we need to start verifying the training data that we use in the first place. So how do we publish that other data? How do we verify the authenticity of different training models? And then what training is needed for the individuals who will be running those testing institutions or organizations in the first place? And something I'm really interested in is how do we give testing suites to individuals so they don't just have to rely on organizations, but they can self-test things too. The last area I want to talk about is something that's really close to my heart, and this is ownership and control in learned systems, because these systems don't operate in isolation. They exist as part of a wider system. And we've seen with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica what happens if the wrong parts of a learned system and the platform it operates on is closed, obfuscated, illegible, or has perverse incentives baked into it. So when you use a service that learns from your behavior and makes decisions on your behalf, whether that be about deciding what brand of loo paper to buy or maybe which school to send your child to, how can you know that that system is working in your best interests? Then as those decisions are made not just about you, but maybe about your community, how can you know that that system understands right from wrong? What is right anyway? As humans, we have morality, but when we're talking about essentially what is a bunch of numbers, how do we make sure that that can understand or know what's best? When you use a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer, they have a professional code of ethics that they must work to. So how can we make the intent of a learned system clear to a user? And where do you think a system's ethical promise should be logged? The other question I have is, which parts of a learned system and the platform it operates on can be of the market? Which parts of the learned system and the platform it operates on has to be open, cooperative, commonly owned, and not part of the market? That's really important, because if there's not enough transparency baked into the way we design and build these systems, how can society ever course correct? You'll remember the financial crisis. That was a systems failure of huge proportion that affected everyone around the world, but it most affected those individuals who have least most severely. I think these areas are the most pertinent issues to be investigating in design, because what you design affects the understanding and access that an individual has to their rights and their ability to have action on them. It is our responsibility to make sure that we design learned systems so that they can be trusted and that they give people digital rights. Thank you.
Questions? So I share probably most people's intimidation of legal terminology and contracts and stuff, and it strikes me that perhaps they are, as you say, sort of something that can be sort of parsed or made simpler to understand. But at the same time, a big part of it, of what I think makes them complex, is that all of that language is there for specificity. It's details, basically, right? And so in a certain way, it strikes me that it's kind of like saying, like, why do we need all this code in this computer program? Like, can't it just do the thing that it's supposed to do? If that's, I don't know if that's a fair analogy, but so my question is basically kind of can you elaborate a little bit on sort of how to kind of bubble that up? And I guess sort of the final point on this is that, it seems like often the thing that sort of screws a person with legal language is not kind of the top level point, but the thing that's kind of buried deep in there.
So I think the question was about the relevance of terms of service to a designer. And then the second part was, what are the ways to design out terms of service? That kind of right. Sorry, I'm not.
I'm sorry. My question was basically sort of how you envision clarifying this kind of language or this kind of system to lay people without sort of like losing the details in those documents that are sort of crucial to the understanding.
I see. So I think that having like terms of service that sometimes you can't even find very easily on a service it just doesn't work at all, because even if you wanted to try and go back to understand something, you can't, or you're not even sure which version it was that you saw when you signed up to the service. So I think that it's really important that an individual understands what information is being collected when a service is learning, what that data is used to do. All the details of it, actually, when it's relevant to them. So I think as you go through a service, I think there are points of asking for consent as a service is running that is a good idea, as opposed to asking for all the consent up front, which is what currently happens. So I think getting smarter about how we can bring in consent throughout a service, but that we have to do that with a lot of research, because I think a speaker earlier mentioned about getting in the way, and that's often part of the tension here, is you need to add friction points to help someone understand, but at the same time, someone may just fundamentally not understand why that could be relevant to them. And then data is, and I think that's part of the problem actually, is that with learned systems, the quantity of data that is being extracted is so huge. I think it's going to be almost impossible for the majority of people to understand that. So I think that looking at how the issues of terms of service gets designed across a service is one way to look at it. But I think ultimately what we should be looking at, and Tom Steinberg blogged about this recently, is what are the kind of collection action points to understand this stuff. You just want to be able to use a service to receive the utility it provides you and not have to worry. And the majority of people just don't have time to check. So I think we have to look to that. But also, I think there's a question about how machines can also help us check because of the quantities of information we're looking at. Yeah.
So to extend this notion of legal systems as code, or code as legal systems, as you well know, regulatory environments and laws are often in conflict within a nation. And so, for example, a program would crash at that point and throw a memory error. Right, but legal systems keep churning on. And of course, a lot of lawyer activity is applying the correct regulation for the correct circumstance and ignoring that one that's in conflict. Now, of course, we are developing technology that has to live in an international environment where it's not enough to just have consistent laws within a nation, but we, the technology providers, builders, have to build things that are consistent across international boundaries. Copyright, for example, varies tremendously from country to country. Australia regulations are very different than US and so on. Tell us what we should be thinking about when one country demands that you delete this data and another country demands that you maintain that data. Suggestions?
Well, so this is an area that I'm really, really interested in. And I think that technology companies, I mean, there's a question about what your experience is as you go from country to country, or as I've come here, the fact there was that point in time where there was a lot of concern that at an airport you could be asked to give over your passwords. Like, then there was no way of me going dark on my phone, so to speak, right? Maybe that should have been an affordance that an organization should have given me. And so this is a question that I'm not going to say I have an answer to, but I think it's something where we need to be designing with the legal teams. I think that when you see like design and development teams, they're often in completely different buildings to where legal are. And so I think far more collaboration between those groups to understand these issues.
Although there's a bug with that, right? I mean, the legal universe that I deal with is way behind the technology that we're developing. I don't know how many times I've had to explain how HTML works and how a web browser works, and it actually makes a copy on your local device. I mean, that's a crazy hard notion for lawyers to understand.
But I think that's where we have to look at this as being a cultural question. So when you look at programs like Oxfam's data responsibility program that they brought in with the engine room, that was something that wasn't about more design. It was actually about facilitating workshops to bring different parts of the organization together to discuss really knotty issues of things like consent in somewhere like Yemen. So I think it has to come from a place of bringing people together that have not been together before. And as designers, remember, we're really good at doing that. Like we are facilitators. So I think I think that has to come first. But I'd love to do more work on that, and I'd love to talk to you afterwards about that. I think it's not a question I can answer super quick. So.
Yasin from DeepMind Ethics and Society. So I was very interested in your idea that certain parts of these systems should operate outside of the market. And I was wondering if you could flesh that out for us a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big research questions that actually we need to explore, and needs certainly academic research as well, so that this can be in the open, because I think it's a really important one. I think that it's all about incentives, I think. So if you have all parts of learned systems and the platforms that they operate on built to a model of capitalism, we know what happens with that model. And we also know what happens with parts of the infrastructure that are critical to running that, the open source infrastructure, that may not receive any funding or has security issues in it because it's not well resourced. Like, we're going to see those issues again, but at a much, much bigger scale with learned systems. I think we have to learn from what we know and think about which parts of these systems have to be what I would call of the commons. And I hope that Dan Hill later might speak a little bit more to some of these issues of ownership. And that's really important, because when something is of the commons or cooperatively owned, there are rules that you set as a group of individuals that you all get to decide on. So it's really going down to the fundamentals of power in these systems. And by power, I mean what kind of rights and capabilities these systems give the majority of us. And I think that's incredibly important to look at. And it's something we have to see, particularly at the speed of software change. And we just won't be able to keep up. We really won't. And I think there's a real risk that we will see huge systems failure again and again and again if we don't give society the ability to see ahead and course correct. That's only going to be possible if we make the important parts of these platforms and systems open. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Mine is more of a comment to a conversation I'd like to provoke. Right. I think, and because I actually see a really connective thread through the three talks that we've heard today, and I would characterize it as the reemergence of ego or self-perception in UX and UI. So a lot of the threads, especially with work, especially about what it means to be user-friendly, especially what it means to have consent, were for a long time there was a lot of incentive alignment between the technology, the UX, and the business model, which is essentially to obfuscate all of this, right? Like we all get the same UI no matter who we are. We all click on the things. We all get, and for that we get things that are really fast, that get cheaper over time, that I don't actually have to give as much information to use. And what we're seeing now is it seems like the role of identity. So if you go to the doctors, is a lot of times like the reason the system's getting rejected is because you're trying to replace part of what they consider into their core identity. For me to have representation in the systems, I have to give some kind of feedback. I really liked your comments about like, one of the things is when you have a certain result and I have a certain result as a UX designer, we need to design for us to be able to compare them. And like, what is that experience like? But it's also moving a lot of work that was obfuscated and was taken care of by the technology to people, right? And I think of Cliff's comment or thinking on user-friendly. And user-friendly used to mean like get as much of it out of the way as possible. And I think there's like this shift going on, right? Where people are raising their hand perhaps to say like, I want to participate more and I actually want more friction because of what I'll get in the end. And I just wanted to kind of connect those. And if anyone wants to talk about that topic, I'd love to talk more about it.
I think it's one of the parts where like user interface design has kind of stayed the same whilst the technologies underneath these services have radically changed. And that's what we're facing. The big questions are kind of centered around that tension point, really, that we've not changed the way that we design.
The notion of "don't make me think" entitled "make me think a lot,"
make me think
all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, although I think that's where there's the real tension bit, which is that I guarantee 99% of people just won't have the time. And so then you get a new design challenge, which is, okay, how do we start to look at cooperative models, which historically are places that are really successful at helping us do stuff together. So I think looking to that as well, which is I don't think has been part of the UX language, but should be.
Thanks a lot. Good. Time for a break. Thanks to all our speakers, and we'll start at 11:45 sharp. Thank you. Snacks are on the side.
It is charging. The planning for afterwards? Yes.